The air in the subterranean Whitehall conference room was dead. It had been processed by humming filtration systems, stripped of any vitality, and now hung heavy with the scent of old coffee, stale sweat, and the faint, acrid tang of fear that no amount of scrubbing could erase. It was not the fear of losing. January 1945 held a different, more complex terror. The fear of what victory would now cost. General William Wild Bill Donovan stood before the oak table, his silhouette cutting a sharp line against the large situation map of Europe. The pins and ribbons told a story of colossal pressure, of armies closing in like a vice. But Donovan was not looking at the advancing fronts. His focus was on two specific points, marked not with regimental colors, but with simple black photographs. One showed the jagged peaks of the Bavarian and Austrian Alps. The other was a grainy architectural schematic, a cross-section of concrete and cramped rooms deep under Berlin. The men facing him were the architects of the coming peace, their faces etched with the exhaustion of a long war. President Franklin Roosevelt sat wrapped in a naval cape, his famous vibrancy dimmed to a banked fire, his eyes holding a profound, weary knowledge. Flanking him were the military chiefs and intelligence coordinators, men who thought in divisions and supply lines. They had come expecting a briefing on the final push. What Donovan delivered was a diagnosis of a dying monster's last, most dangerous convulsion. He began not with the mission, but with the aftermath. He presented a series of captured German documents, stamped with the highest secrecy classifications. They were not battle plans. They were blueprints for national suicide, detailed engineering schematics for the systematic destruction of German industry, mine shafts to be collapsed with precise charges, hydroelectric dams to be blown, railway tunnels to be sealed forever. A companion dossier outlined the fanatical doctrine of Alpine Fortress, the meticulous transfer of the Nazi Corps, the gold reserves, the most advanced weapons research, into an impregnable mountain redoubt. It was a plan to turn southern Germany into a poisoned citadel, a place where the war could be prolonged for years, bleeding Allied armies in a nightmare of Alpine warfare. One of the generals, a man with a bulldog's jaw, shifted impatiently. "We'll bomb them into submission. They're finished." Donovan's response was a cold, physical object. He placed a small, lumpy piece of dark metal on the polished oak. It was a fragment of a V-2 rocket casing, still smelling faintly of cordite and scorched earth. "This landed in Chiswick last week. It killed a family of 4 in their home. They are not finished. They are descending into a terminal psychosis. And a psychotic, cornered animal, with the technical capability to build these," he tapped the fragment, "and who is now building factories for newer, deadlier weapons inside mountains, is not an enemy we can simply outlast." He then turned to the human calculus. A slim folder, passed to the president, contained intercepted communications from Berlin to regional Gauleiters. The orders were unmistakable. If retreat became inevitable, nothing of value was to be left for the enemy. Infrastructure, food stores, transportation, all were to be annihilated. The strategy was no longer about defense. It was about ensuring the Allies liberated a charnel house, a wasteland that would breed chaos, disease, and a bitterness that would cripple Europe for decades. The room grew colder. The strategic implications were monstrously clear. Every day the war continued under the current command was a day in which Germany was methodically preparing its own mutilation. The brain coordinating this autodaf Donovan said, his voice low and relentless, resides here. His finger slammed onto the photograph of the Alps. Or here. It moved to the bunker schematic. Adolf Hitler is no longer a military commander. He is the chief engineer of a G-Marung. His death now is not a tactical objective. It is a triage procedure. We are not assassinating a head of state. We are performing an excision on a malignant necrotizing force to save the body of a continent from further gangrene. The proposal he laid out was audacious in its simplicity, terrifying in its risk. Operation Phantom. A 3-person team, a surgical instrument composed of a sniper, a saboteur, and a cultural linguist. A native conduit. They would be dropped into the collapsing chaos of Brandenburg, expected to navigate the dying Reich's internal rot, penetrate the ever-tightening security around a paranoid Führer, and execute him, not on a battlefield, but in his lair, in Berlin or at the Berghof. President Roosevelt studied the bunker schematic for a long time. His question, when it came, was not about feasibility. It was about legacy. If they succeed, do we risk making him a martyr? A saint for the lost cause? Donovan had the answer ready, an answer that walked the fine edge of cynicism and truth. A martyr dies for a faith that lives on. Our intelligence indicates the faith is already shattered. The German army is fighting out of fear, not belief. The populace is broken. A martyr needs a narrative of hope and betrayal. What we are witnessing is the collapse of reality itself around him. A bullet in a bunker or a bomb in a mountain retreat does not create a martyr. It provides a full stop. It prevents him from controlling the final, destructive sentence of his own story. It stops him from ordering the flooding of minds that will drown thousands of his own people. It stops him from commanding children to die for a Reich that already exists, only in his mind. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of men comprehending a horrific equation. Letting Hitler live meant accepting, by conscious inaction, the systematic ruin of Germany and the prolongation of a war of attrition in the Alps. Authorizing the mission was a gamble with deniability and geopolitical fallout, but it was an active move to sever the nerve center of the destruction. Roosevelt's gaze lifted from the papers, sweeping the room before settling back on Donovan. The president's face was a mask of profound moral exhaustion. He was not authorizing a strike. He was choosing between 2 kinds of bloodshed: the chaotic, drawn-out bleeding of a continent, or the swift, dark act that might stanch it. He gave a single, slow nod. No words. The approval was in the grim set of his jaw, the heavy-lidded acceptance in his eyes. As the meeting broke and the powerful men filed out, a senior aide from the Joint Chiefs, a man known for his ruthless pragmatism, lingered for a moment beside Donovan. He did not look at the OSS chief. Instead, he stared at the Alpine fortress map, his voice barely a whisper. "See that they understand the parameters, Bill. Complete deniability. And make certain your team knows their primary objective is the cessation of strategic command, whatever it takes. The humanitarian objective. Everything else is secondary. Priorities can shift in real time based on the larger picture." The man left without another word. Donovan was alone in the room with the maps and the ghost of the decision now made. He carefully collected the V2 fragment, its metal cold in his palm. He had sold the mission as an act of mercy, a surgical strike to prevent suffering. And he believed that truth. But the aide's carefully chosen words, the larger picture, hung in the processed air, like a ghost of a different mission, one not yet articulated. He had gotten his phantom authorized, but as he switched off the lights, plunging the war room into darkness save for the single bulb over the map of Germany, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground cold. He had unleashed a weapon, but in the shadows of that room, he could not shake the feeling that the weapon and the men who would wield it were already being measured for a sacrifice far greater than any had dared to speak aloud. The ghost was now real, and it was walking into a darkness deeper than any night drop over Brandenburg. The sun in southern Italy was a brutal, unforgiving lie. It baked the ancient stones of the abandoned monastery turned OSS forward base, painting everything in a deceptive golden wash. Here, far from the damp chill of the London bunker, the war felt like an abstraction. But inside the thick stone walls of the central courtyard, 3 people stood in a patch of sharp shadow, their reality being meticulously and coldly reshaped. They were not soldiers in any conventional sense. They were specialists, weapons honed for a single purpose, and they were only now learning the true shape of the target they were meant to strike. Their handler was Captain John Ace Roberts, a man who moved with the relaxed grace of a former collegiate boxer, but whose eyes held the flat, assessing coolness of a pathologist. He did not brief them. He performed an autopsy on the future. The courtyard was their classroom. A large-scale, 3-dimensional model of central Berlin dominated the space. Not the proud city of pre-war postcards, but a jagged, broken landscape of shattered plaster and painted rubble. Roberts walked them through it not with a pointer, but with a narrative of decay. "Forget frontline combat," he began, his voice cutting through the dry heat. "Your battlefield is this." He gestured at the model's ruined streets. "Chaos is your cover. Desperation is your currency. You will not fight the Wehrmacht. You will become ghosts, moving through its dying nervous system." He introduced them to their new identities, a set of forged papers and histories that felt like ill-fitting skins. They were to be a displaced East Prussian factory technician, his shell-shocked sister, and a mute laborer, refugees swallowed by the great bleeding tide of humanity fleeing the Eastern Front. Then he presented the tools, not just weapons, but instruments of a dark art. A modified Winchester Model 70 sniper rifle, disassembled and packed in a custom-cut diplomatic case, its components disguised as parts of a surveying theodolite. Blocks of pliable, odorless plastic explosive, labeled as machine lubricant. A suite of lockpicks forged from blackened surgical steel, and a small, deadly pharmacy, ampules of morphine, syringes filled with clear, paralytic agents, cyanide capsules mounted in hollowed-out molars. Each object was a sentence in a grammar of silent killing. Only then did Roberts force the human element to intersect. He made them study not just maps, but faces. A gallery of photographs was pinned to a sun-bleached board. Hitler, of course, in various uniforms and angles. But more importantly, the faces around him. The twitchy, paranoid SS guards, like Hitler's shadow, Hermann Fegelein. The gaunt, fanatical architecture of Martin Bormann. The cadaverous weakness of Joseph Goebbels. Roberts drilled them. These are the patterns. The Führer's movements are now like tremors in a dying body, unpredictable, but following the paths of least resistance within his own collapsing world. He may go to the ruined chancellery to be photographed with brave boys from the Hitler Youth. He may attempt a trip to the Oder front, or he may never leave the bunker again. Your mission is to find the tremor and be the fault line that breaks it. It was during this study that the team's own fractures and motivations began to surface, not through confession, but through stark, telling reactions. Jack Teller, the sniper, was a man of oppressive stillness. In his late 30s, with hands that were unnervingly steady and eyes the color of a winter lake, he absorbed the tactical data with a frightening, total focus. But when Roberts presented an aerial photograph of the Auschwitz complex, intelligence having tenuously linked a shift in Hitler's personal train schedule to a visit there in '44, Teller's stillness changed. It didn't break, it deepened, becoming glacial, absolute. He said nothing. He simply stared at the photograph until Roberts moved on, his knuckles bleaching white where they rested on the table. His hatred was not a fire. It was a core of permafrost. And the mission was the drill meant to reach it. Erika Steiner, the linguist and conduit, was the team's cultural shadow. Austrian-born, her accent could shift from Berlin aristocratic to Bavarian rural with chilling ease. She was to be their eyes and ears, the one who would navigate the moral ruin of the Reich. As Roberts detailed the planned link-up with the remnants of the Berlin underground, the Red Orchestra survivors, a subtle tension wired itself into her posture. She knew, with a visceral certainty they could not, that the city's resistance had been ground to dust by the Gestapo. Her role was to project a confidence she did not feel, to be the believable German in a landscape of universal suspicion. Her motivation was not revenge, but a desperate, expiating need to cut the head off the monster her homeland had unleashed, to prove that not all German speakers were the enemy. Leo, the Hammer Markovitz, the demolitionist, was a physical contrast to Teller's ice. A bear of a man with thick, scarred hands, he was a Polish exile whose entire family had vanished into the smoky geography of the general government. For him, the model of Berlin was not a tactical puzzle. It was a graveyard he intended to desecrate. He asked no questions about escape routes or cover stories. His queries were brutally technical. The thickness of the F-4 bunker's reinforced concrete ceiling, the composition of the mortar between the stones of the Berghof's Great Hall, the likely make and vulnerability of the armored Mercedes in the motorcade. His participation was not a mission. It was a sacrament of destruction, a personal coup de grace delivered to the regime that had erased his world. For days, Roberts fused them into a single unit through relentless, unconventional drills. They practiced silent kills in the monastery's catacombs, not on mannequins, but on hanging sides of beef, to learn the true resistance of flesh and bone. They rehearsed their cover story under interrogation, with Roberts playing a vicious, insightful Gestapo agent who zeroed in on every inconsistency, every flicker of doubt. They learned to communicate with micro-gestures, a tap of a finger, a specific way of closing a notebook, a blink pattern. The final exercise was the most chilling. Roberts blindfolded them, drove them for hours into the Apennine foothills, and deposited them in a simulated Berlin, a bombed-out village used for training. Their objective: locate a specific cellar, the bunker, plant a simulated charge, and exfiltrate to a rendezvous, all while avoiding SS patrols, played by grim-faced American MPs. They failed twice. The first time, Markovitz's aggressive approach triggered an early alert. The second time, Steiner's overcaution led to them missing a crucial window. The third time, under a moonless sky, something clicked. Teller's preternatural patience identified a patrol pattern. Steiner's intuition guided them through a seemingly impassable rubble choke point. Markovitz's brute strength quietly cleared the way. They succeeded in a cold, efficient silence. Afterward, standing sweat-soaked and covered in dust in the pre-dawn gray, Roberts offered his only praise. It was not warm. "Adequate," he said, lighting a cigarette. "You stopped being three individuals out there. You became a single tool. Remember that feeling. In Berlin, sentiment, history, personal vendetta, they are liabilities. You are a mechanism, a trigger, waiting to be pulled." He left them with a final curated piece of intelligence, intercepted, decaying German radio traffic, suggesting Hitler's declining mental state, his rages, his physical tremors. It was meant to bolster them, to paint the target as vulnerable. But as they walked back to the transport truck, the first sliver of sun cutting the horizon, the three tools allowed themselves a moment of humanity. Teller meticulously cleaned non-existent dirt from his glasses. Steiner wrapped her arms around herself against the dawn chill. Markovitz cracked his massive knuckles one by one. They had been forged into a weapon of exquisite purpose. They believed they understood the weight, the morality, the desperate necessity of their mission. They had no inkling that the hand holding them, the command in London, was already calculating the angle at which they might be thrown against an unyielding surface, not to pierce it, but to see what cracks the impact would reveal. The ghost team was ready. They just didn't know they were already haunting the wrong house. The sky over Brandenburg was not black. It was a sick, pulsating violet, stained from the horizon by the eternal distant fireglow of burning Berlin and shot through with the wandering fingers of searchlights. The converted B-24 Liberator, stripped of all insignia, flew a gut-churning, evasive route, a metal ghost threading between known flak corridors. Inside the shuddering fuselage, in a cold that seared the lungs, the three figures sat strapped to their static lines, encased in the smell of engine oil, cold sweat, and the sharp, animal scent of adrenaline. Their insertion was not a silent drop into a waiting wilderness. It was a violent expulsion into chaos. The plane's navigator, his voice thin with strain over the intercom, gave a terse warning. A mobile flak battery, not on their maps, had opened up from a patch of woodland. The plane jinked violently. The jump light blinked from red to a frantic, oscillating green. There was no time for final checks, for rehearsed nods. The dispatcher, face grim, just yanked open the hatch. The howling void screamed in, a maelstrom of freezing wind and engine roar. They went out into it in quick succession. Teller, a sharp silhouette. Steiner, a compact shadow. Markovitz, a dense mass swallowed by the night. The descent was a silent, terrifying struggle against buffeting winds. The ground below was not the neat farmland of their briefing photos. It was a fractured, dark landscape, dotted with the sullen red embers of burned-out villages, and veined with the faint, moving lights of military convoys. Teller, the natural point of reference, fought to keep them oriented towards their planned drop zone, a field near a supposed derelict mill. They landed hard, miles apart, in a world of sound and fury. The crump of distant artillery was a constant, irregular heartbeat. Closer, the stuttering cough of a German MG-42 machine gun dueled with the deeper-throated reply of a Soviet PPSH. The front line here wasn't a line at all. It was a soaked, bleeding sponge of contested territory. Steiner, disentangling herself from her chute in a frozen fallow field,
Use the brief, stark illumination of a distant flare to get her bearings. The protocol was absolute radio silence unless for emergency. They had to find the primary rally point, the foundation stones of the old windmill. Moving with a predator's caution, she melted into the tree line, her senses stretched to a razor's edge. Every shadow was a threat, every rustle a potential betrayal. It was Markovitz who found the mill first, or what was left of it. A shell had taken off its top, leaving a skeletal ruin. He was already there, a darker shadow among shadows, securing the perimeter with a predatory efficiency. Teller arrived last, his sniper's case, a sinister oblong, strapped to his back. Their reunion was wordless, a series of hand signals in the gloom. They had survived the drop. Now the true mission began. Their first objective was a safe house, a forester's cottage 10 kilometers to the east, operated by a contact supposedly linked to the fragmented German communist resistance. To get there, they had to cross a landscape that was the pure, undiluted essence of a dying regime. They moved by night through woods littered with the detritus of retreat. Abandoned helmets, a single frozen boot, the cratered carcass of a Panzer IV, its interior scorched and smelling of cooked metal and death. By day, they hid in bomb craters, drainage ditches half filled with icy water, and once, terrifyingly, in the attic of a barn that still held the warm, pungent smell of cattle below, while a squad of weary Volkssturm, old men and boys, bivouacked underneath, their voices a mixture of bravado and naked, trembling fear. It was on the second night, skirting a main road still used by German military traffic, that they encountered their first live test, a patrol. Not the disciplined Wehrmacht of old, but a ragged, nervous group of 3. 2 boys no older than 16 in ill-fitting uniforms, led by a hollow-cheeked man in his 50s, with a Volkssturm armband and an ancient bolt-action rifle. They were sweeping the roadside ditches with a single, flickering lantern, more terrified of their own officers than of the enemy. The team froze, pressed into the mud and frozen reeds. The protocol was clear: avoid contact at all costs. But the lantern's beam swept closer. One of the boys, his voice cracking with tension, thought he saw a shape. He raised his own rifle, a panic shot waiting to happen.
The older man hissed at him to be quiet, to lower his weapon, his eyes wide with the shared, unspoken understanding that engaging someone in the dark was a quick way to die. In that suspended second, poised on a knife's edge, Markovitz made the decision. It wasn't tactical. It was visceral, a reaction honed in the Warsaw ghetto. As the boy's finger fumbled near the trigger, Markovitz moved. It was not the graceful, silent kill of their training. It was a brutal, wet eruption of violence from the darkness. One moment the boy was there, a silhouette against the lantern light. The next there was a muffled choke, the sound of a heavy knife striking home, and a soft, collapsing thud into the mud. The other boy screamed, a short, high sound cut off as Teller's hand clamped over his mouth from behind, a precise, vicious jerk of his head silencing him forever. The older man turned, not to fight, but to run, to plead, his rifle falling. Steiner was on him, not with a knife, but with the syringe from her medical kit. She plunged it into his neck, her own face a mask of horrified necessity. The paralytic agent acted in seconds. The man's eyes, wide with a betrayal that was both personal and cosmic, locked onto hers as his muscles seized and he slumped, drowning silently in the shallow, icy water of the ditch. The violence was over in less than 10 seconds. The lantern had fallen, guttering out in the mud. They were left in utter darkness, the only sounds their own ragged breathing and the distant war. The smell, copper-rich blood, voided bowels, and the chemical scent of the drug filled the cold air. Steiner stared at her hands, then at the old man's face, already settling into the waxen calm of death. He had a wedding ring. He was someone's grandfather pressed into a war he didn't want. She had killed a fellow German. The ideological clarity of the OSS monastery evaporated. This was the reality. Murder in a ditch to protect a secret. Markovitz wiped his knife clean on the boy's uniform, his own breathing steady, his eyes reflecting no remorse, only a grim satisfaction of a threat eliminated. Teller methodically searched the bodies, taking any useful papers, tossing their weapons into the deeper woods. His face was unreadable, a stone carving. They left the bodies where they lay, just 3 more casualties in the nightly harvest of a collapsing front. The walk to the forester's cottage was conducted in a profound, heavy silence, each member carrying the weight of the ditch in a different way. The mission was no longer an abstract plan on a model in Italy. It was blood under their fingernails, a moral stain that had to be justified by the ultimate target. When they finally reached the cottage just before dawn, it was a burned-out shell, a recent fire. The blackened timbers were still warm. A message or a coincidence? There was no contact, no supplies, only the chilling evidence that someone, whether Gestapo or just marauding deserters, had been there before them. Crouched in the woods, watching the smoke rise in the pale morning light, they conducted their first whispered council of war. Their carefully laid network was dust. They were alone, deep inside the wolves' forest, with the pack turning on itself around them. The only asset they had left was the target himself and the chaotic vortex that surrounded him. They had to move from being inserted agents to becoming creatures of that vortex, to use the anarchy not just as cover, but as a weapon. Berlin was now a grim beacon, a black hole pulling all light and hope into its core. They had no choice but to follow the pull, carrying the ghosts of the ditch with them into the heart of the dark. Berlin was not a city. It was a geological event, a sprawling open wound in the crust of the earth, exhaling a stench that hung for miles in the freezing air. A potpourri of cordite, wet cinder, rotting flesh, and the underlying, sweetly chemical taint of burst gas mains. The journey from the outer suburbs to the crumbling heart was a descent through rings of a personalized hell, a grim parody of Dante, authored by 1,000 bombers. The team infiltrated not as soldiers, but as mutations of the landscape. They moved through neighborhoods where buildings stood like hollow, shattered teeth, their exposed interiors offering surreal, tragic tableaus. A grand piano suspended over an abyss on a single remaining floorboard, a tattered wedding dress fluttering from a broken beam. They navigated by the new, terrible geography, the mountain of rubble on Potsdamer Platz, the lake of flooded craters in the Tiergarten. The people they passed were ghosts in rags, their eyes holding the flat, glazed sheen of profound shock, digging in the ruins with bare hands, not for possessions, but for scraps of fuel or canned food. Steiner became their essential organ, their guide through this terminal sociology. It was her ear, tuned to the subtle dialects of despair and authority, that identified the real power structures. The Wehrmacht was a broken skeleton, its units intermingled, officers without men, men without orders, all drifting towards the final defensive ring around the government district. The true terror now was the SS and the Gestapo, their fanaticism distilled to a pure, paranoid venom by impending doom. They moved in sleek armored vehicles or in tight nervous knots, executing deserters from lamp posts with hastily scrawled placards, "I betrayed the FHRR," still warm around their necks. Then there were the party functionaries, the gauleiters and blockwarts, desperately trying to enforce a dead ideology, demanding papers from people who had nothing left but their lives. Their new safe house was a tomb, the basement of a collapsed apartment block near the Kreuzberg district, accessed through a canyon of fallen masonry. The air was thick with dust and the pervasive smell of damp mortar. Here, amidst the roots of the dead city, they began the meticulous, feverish work of building an assassination from nothing. Each member became a specialist in a different facet of the beast's anatomy. Leo Markovitz, the saboteur, mutated into a ghoul of the rubble. He would vanish for days at a time, returning with his pack heavier, his hands stained with grease and soot. His was the tangible hunt. He mapped sewer lines that might offer access to the government district, sketching the routes in a water-stained notebook. He located, and with terrifying nonchalance, liberated supplies from abandoned Wehrmacht depots, blocks of German Nobel 808 explosive, more stable and powerful than their OSS issue, bundles of detonation cord, even a pair of Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, which he described as door knockers. His greatest prize was a set of utility blueprints, stolen from the pocket of a dead municipal engineer, detailing the pre-war steam and electrical tunnels beneath the Wilhelmstrasse. He lived in a world of pressure points and structural weaknesses, calculating the exact charge needed to collapse the Voss Street bunker entrance or to swallow a motorcade into the street. Jack Teller, the sniper, pursued a more ephemeral prey, patterns and habits in a universe designed to be random. From their basement, he could not see the Reich Chancellery, but he built a map of it in his mind. Through Steiner's network of whispered contacts, a half-mad old journalist surviving on tinned liverwurst, a terrified clerk from the propaganda ministry who traded information for morphine syrettes, he pieced together the ghostly routine of a man who no longer lived in the sun. Hitler's world had contracted to a series of concrete rooms, but he was known to occasionally ascend, to tour the ruins for morale, to stand in the shattered grandeur of the Chancellery Garden. Teller identified 3 potential firing positions: the shell of the former French embassy, a particular smokestack on a ruined factory with a sightline down Wilhelmstrasse, and, most promisingly, a bombed-out department store on the Hermann G. Ringstrasse. He would infiltrate these positions alone, lying for hours in the freezing cold, memorizing wind patterns off the hot rubble, measuring distances with the clinical precision of a surveyor, waiting for a target that might never appear. Erika Steiner, the linguist, navigated the most dangerous terrain, the human psyche of the collapsing Reich. Her mission was intelligence, the flow of information that would tell them when the target would briefly emerge from its shell. She re-established a ghost of the Red Orchestra network, not with idealists, but with survivors motivated by a desperate desire to buy a shred of mercy or a guarantee of food. Her key source was a man named Franz, a mid-level administrator in the Reichsbank, who had access to the logistical schedules for the government district: food deliveries, coal shipments, courier movements.
From him, she learned not of grand strategy, but of telling minutiae. An order for a specific mineral water to be delivered to the Vorbunker. A sudden demand for additional diesel fuel for the emergency generators. A change in the rotation of the SS Guard Company at the new Reich Chancellery entrance. These were the vital signs of the beast in its hole. But from Franz, she also harvested a more chilling, strategic piece of intelligence. He whispered, his breath reeking of fear and schnapps, that his brother-in-law in signals intelligence had intercepted strange traffic. Not German, not Soviet.
Coded signals in a new cipher, originating from the outskirts of the city, being tracked by a special Gestapo unit, reporting directly to Kaltenbrunner. The unit's nickname was Fremde Geister, foreign ghosts. The Gestapo, Franz hissed, believed a Western Allied Special Operations team was already in Berlin. The implications landed in the basement like a lead weight. They were not just hunters. They were being hunted. The facade of secrecy was cracking. This pressure cooker of planning, scavenging, and paranoia was punctuated by the brutal rhythm of the siege. Soviet artillery fired now around the clock, a relentless, seismic drumming that shook dust from their ceiling. The Stalin-Orgel rocket salvos would arrive without warning, a shrieking chorus followed by earth-shaking detonations that made the very rubble seem to flinch. During one such barrage, as they huddled in the deepest corner of their cellar, the world dissolved into noise and vibration. A direct hit, somewhere above, sheared away part of their protective masonry, and a cascade of bricks and plaster buried their radio, their one fragile thread to the distant, clean world of the OSS. When the dust settled and the ringing in their ears subsided, they dug the set out. It was a twisted, silent lump of metal and wiring. The umbilical cord was cut. For 2 days, they operated in a profound and unsettling silence, the lack of contact from London feeling like a physical void. Then, on the 3rd day, using a makeshift antenna rigged from wire Markovits stripped from the ruins, Teller managed to coax a trickle of power, to hear a distorted, fragmented signal pushing through the static. It was their designated backup frequency. The message from Captain Roberts was short, brutal, and encrypted. It took Steiner an hour to decipher it, her face growing paler with each translated group. The orders had shifted. The primary objective was no longer stated. Instead, the priority was now package acquisition, followed by coordinates for a secondary cache of intelligence materials, archives, personal papers of the High Command, deemed of supreme strategic value. The liquidation of the primary target was now conditional. Execute only if package acquisition is impossible or compromises the principal objective of strategic intelligence gathering. The message ended with a terse reminder of deniability protocols. In the dim, dust-choked light of the tomb, the 3 of them stared at the decoded words. The humanitarian imperative, the moral surgery to save lives, it had been quietly demoted. They were now explicitly intelligence gatherers. Hitler's death was a secondary concern, a discretionary item on a list. Markovits crumpled a piece of drafting paper in his massive fist, his jaw a hard knot of muscle. Teller simply looked at his rifle, then at the wall, his expression unchanging but his eyes holding a new, cold calculus. Steiner felt a hollow open in her stomach. Franz's whisper about the Fremde Geister echoed in her mind. They were not just being hunted by the Gestapo. They had just been quietly, professionally, downgraded by their own command. The ghost team was now adrift in the dying beast's belly, with orders that had just rewritten their purpose, and a growing, chilling certainty that they were assets in a game whose final moves were being planned far away, over maps where they were not even pawns, but mere notations. The silence after the broken transmission was not empty. It was a dense, living entity that filled their basement tomb, thick with the unspoken realization that they had been orphaned. The revised orders from Captain Roberts lay between them like a dead thing. The words package acquisition and conditional execution echoing in the cavernous new space that had opened between their purpose and their command's intentions. For 2 days, the team operated in a state of suspended animation, a machine idling without a driver. Markovitz continued his grim foraging, but his actions now had a furious, mechanical quality. Teller maintained his watch schedules, scanning the haunted cityscape through his scope, but his focus had turned inward, his mind recalculating angles of a different sort. Steiner moved through her dwindling network like a somnambulist, collecting the same data points, but now viewing them through a new, sinister lens. The turning point came from the unlikeliest of sources, the Soviet advance. The Red Army's artillery, once a distant thunder, was now a proximate quake. The distinct, chattering roar of T-34 tanks could be heard in the neighboring district. With the front line collapsing inward by the hour, the already fractured human landscape of Berlin underwent a final, terrifying schism. The fanatics, the SS, the Hitler Youth, dug in with a berserker's glee, preparing to die in the rubble. The vast majority, soldiers and civilians alike, were now gripped by a singular primal objective: survival, or failing that, a quick death before the Russians arrived. It was in this atmosphere of terminal panic that Steiner made contact with her most dangerous asset, the man they called the librarian. He was not a resistor, but a former academic, an archivist from the Ahnenerbe, the SS's pseudo-scientific research division, who had seen the horrific reality behind the mythological facade and had retreated into a protective shell of bureaucratic cynicism. He was a man who traded in secrets because they were the only currency he had left. Meeting him was a descent into another layer of the underworld, a bunker beneath the burned-out shell of the University of Berlin, a catacomb lined with metal filing cabinets salvaged from a dozen ruined ministries. The man was cadaverous, his eyes magnified behind thick glasses, his fingers stained with ink and ash. He did not want morphine or food. He wanted a guarantee, a signed piece of paper from the Allies promising he would not be handed over to the Soviets. It was a promise Steiner could not possibly keep, but she forged the document on the spot with chilling skill, using the seal from a dead Gauleiter's ring Markovitz had looted. The transaction was simple. She gave him the forgery. In return, he gave her a single, thin folder. It was not military intelligence. It was an OSS personnel file, or a flawless replica of one. It contained a psychological profile, mission parameters, and a candid assessment of the operational risks of a team designated Phantom. The file was marked with the correct encryption stamps she recognized from Italy. But the assessment was not addressed to Donovan. It was a memo from Captain John Roberts to a deputy director of planning, dated 3 weeks after their insertion. The contents were a clinical dissection of their expendability. The team was evaluated not for its likelihood of success, but for its utility as a strategic stimulus.
The memo posited that even the credible threat of a Western assassination attempt, if allowed to filter into the Nazi security apparatus, would achieve several desirable outcomes. It would fix Hitler's location, forcing him deeper into static, defensible positions that could be monitored. It would consume SS resources better deployed on the front. Most critically, it might provoke a terminal paranoia within the FTR bunker, potentially accelerating internal purges and command fragmentation, thereby shortening the final battle for Berlin. The actual elimination of Hitler was listed under potential secondary benefits, followed by a chilling footnote. Liquidation may, in the final analysis, prove less advantageous than allowing the target to witness the full consequences of his strategic failure. A martyr is clean. A living architect of ruin forced to inhabit his collapsing edifice provides a more potent historical lesson. The final paragraph was a cold cost-benefit analysis of their deniability. Their capture or death by German forces was regrettable but operationally neutral. Their capture by the Soviets, however, was deemed problematic, as it could provide proof of Western clandestine action in the agreed Soviet sector. Contingencies for sterilization of the team in such a scenario were outlined in vague, bureaucratic terms that made Steiner's blood freeze. She read the document 3 times in the flickering light of the archivist's oil lamp. The words did not shout. They whispered, and their whisper was more terrible than any shell burst. The humanitarian mandate was a lie. The surgical strike was a fiction. They were not a scalpel. They were a lit match tossed into a powder keg, whose true purpose was to see how big the explosion would be, and to perhaps make the final collapse more photographically complete. Their lives, their morality, the blood in the Brandenburg ditch, all of it was just data in a remote, cynical equation. Returning to the basement was like walking back into her own coffin. She placed the folder on their makeshift table, a slab of broken marble. She said nothing. She simply watched as Teller and Markovitz read it. The reaction was not explosive. It was a slow, deep freeze. Teller's face, usually so impassive, underwent a subtle, terrifying transformation. His eyes, which held the cold focus of a hunter, now acquired the flat, empty sheen of a weapon that knows it has been aimed at its own user. He slowly closed the file and pushed it away, as if it were contaminated. His gaze went to his rifle case, then to the rough sketch of the firing positions taped to the wall. The target was still there. But the reason for the crosshairs had just evaporated, leaving only the personal, frozen core of his hatred. Markovitz reacted with a low, guttural sound that was not quite a word. He stood up, his massive frame seeming to fill the low cellar. He paced, a caged bear, his hands opening and closing. The file had not just betrayed the mission. It had insulted his vengeance. It had made his deeply personal wrath into a petty variable in a spreadsheet. He stopped pacing and looked at the stash of explosives piled in the corner. Then at Steiner, his eyes asking a silent, furious question. What now? The team was fractured along the lines of their core motivations. Steiner, the ideologue who believed in a necessary moral act, felt the foundations of her world turn to ash. The cause was corrupt. Teller, the consummate professional who subsumed his personal pain to the objective, saw the objective revealed as a sham. Only Markovitz's primal drive for retribution remained intact, but it was now untethered, dangerous, and directionless. That night, as a particularly heavy Soviet barrage walked its line of fire across their district, They held their council of war in the trembling dark. The military reality was inescapable. They were in a city days, perhaps hours, from falling. The Gestapo's Fremde Geisterhunt was an active threat, and their own command viewed them as disposable provocations. It was Teller who broke the impasse, his voice a dry, calm rasp in the darkness. He articulated the new, terrible calculus. To follow Robert's orders and hunt for packages was to become errand boys in the apocalypse, validating their own manipulation. To exfiltrate was impossible. The city was sealed by iron rings of fanatics and Soviets. To stay was to die either in the crossfire or in a Gestapo cellar. There was, he posited, only one action that reclaimed any shred of meaning, that answered both the betrayal and the original personal oaths they had each sworn. They would complete the mission. Not for the OSS. Not for the cynical strategists in London.
But for the dead in the camps, Teller never spoke of. For the vanished family in Warsaw. For the soul of a Germany. Steiner still hoped could be saved from itself. They would kill Hitler because it was the right thing to do, stripped of all political calculation. It would be an act of pure, defiant will. A statement that in the midst of the great cynical game, some individuals could still choose a target and pull a trigger for reasons that belonged only to them. It was a suicide pact dressed in the language of agency. And in that basement, shaking with each incoming shell, it felt like the only form of freedom left to them. They unanimously, silently agreed. The Ghost Team was officially rogue. They were no longer assets of the OSS. They were now a private, three-person army, waging a one-night war against the entire collapsing Reich, with nothing to lose but the last shreds of their own humanity. The final hunt was on, but the hunters had just changed masters, answering now only to the ghosts they carried within. The decision to go rogue did not fill them with righteous fervor. It settled upon them like a chemical change, a hardening of their individual essences into a single, diamond-hard point of purpose. The OSS was dead to them. The war was background noise. The only reality that existed was the 3-block radius of shattered grandeur around the Reich Chancellery and the concrete labyrinth beneath it. They were no longer soldiers or agents. They were a force of nature with a singular intent, and Berlin's death throes became the perfect camouflage for their final move. Their planning shed all pretense of broader strategy. It became brutally, beautifully simple. Markovitz's meticulous mapping of the underground yielded the critical vector, a maintenance tunnel for the pre-war pneumatic mail system, long forgotten, that ran from the cellar of a ruined post office near the Wilhelmplatz to within 50 meters of the Vorbunker's outer ventilation block. It was a tight, filthy crawl space clogged with rubble and rat skeletons, but it was a thread leading directly to the beast's den. The plan was a two-pronged symphony of violence, each movement dependent on the other, each member playing a final, definitive role. Markovitz would be the spear point. His task was to infiltrate the tunnel, navigate its suffocating length, and plant a shaped charge on the ventilation intake manifold. His secondary charge, smaller and more precise, was for the blast door leading from the ventilation chamber into the bunker's lower levels. His job was not to blow up the entire complex, an impossibility with their resources, but to create a catastrophic breach, a violent rupture in the bunker's sterile, pressurized world. The explosion would suck the oxygen from corridors, fill them with dust and debris, and, with luck, rupture water or sewage lines, triggering panic and chaos in the carefully ordered hierarchy of the tomb. It was the hammer blow on the hornet's nest. Teller was the scalpel. He rejected the distant, passive sniper positions. The Soviet artillery had made them untenable, and the target would not present himself in the open again. His new firing position was to be the upper floor of the ruined Reich Chancellery itself. While Markovitz's explosion turned the bunker inward in panic, Teller would infiltrate the shattered palace above it. From there, he would have a view of the internal courtyard and the bunker's main emergency exit, the only route of escape once the lower levels were compromised. His shot would be at extreme close range for his craft, less than 100 meters, but in a maelstrom of smoke, running figures, and confusion. He would have to identify his target amidst a swarm of identical gray uniforms, and make the kill in a window of seconds. It was the ultimate test of his icy patience and preternatural focus. Steiner was the nervous system. She would not enter the tunnel or the chancellery. Her role was to orchestrate the chaos from the outside. Using the last of her network's leverage, a mix of blackmail, forged orders, and promises of safe passage, she would engineer a diversion of monumental proportions. She targeted not the SS, but the ragged remnants of the Wehrmacht's 18th Panzer Grenadier Division, clinging to positions near the Brandenburg Gate. Through a chain of whispers and a single, perfectly forged order from the F-Horror's headquarters, she would create a phantom Soviet breakthrough, ordering a desperate, chaotic counterattack down the Hermann-G. Ringstrasse at the precise 0 hour. The goal was to draw the outer layers of the SS security cordon away from the government district, to add another layer of violent confusion to the night. The preparation was a ballet of grim professionalism, conducted in the shadow of the end. Markovitz spent hours in a sub-basement, molding his Nobel 808 charges with the care of a sculptor, calculating shaped cone liners to focus the blast. He tested the ignition systems with a watchmaker's precision. His tools were no longer just for destruction. They were the instruments of his final, definitive statement. Teller disassembled and reassembled his Winchester 7 times, polishing every component until it gleamed in the faint light. He loaded each round himself, weighing the powder charges, seating the bullets with a micrometer's consistency. He practiced target acquisition in the dark of the basement, snapping the unloaded rifle to his shoulder, holding his breath, his finger resting on the trigger, imagining the moment the crosshairs would settle not on a silhouette, but on the living, breathing face of the man who had become the dark sun of his world. Steiner became a phantom playwright. She wrote the script of the fake attack order, studying captured Wehrmacht documents for the exact, clipped phrasing. She secured a functioning typewriter from the ruins of an adjutancy and typed the order on legitimate Wehrmacht stationery Markovitz had stolen. She then orchestrated its delivery using a traumatized Hitler Youth runner she bribed with American chocolate, telling him it was a vital message from a heroic general. The document entered the broken German command chain, a ghost in the machine. The night of the operation arrived not with fanfare, but with a creeping, radioactive stillness. The artillery barrage had momentarily shifted eastward. A freezing, drizzling rain began to fall, coating the rubble in a slick, black sheen. It was time. Their parting in the basement was not sentimental. There were no handshakes, no words of luck. They had become extensions of the plan itself. Markovitz nodded once, hefted his pack of death, and melted into the rain to find the post office cellar entrance. Teller checked his rifle one last time, slung the case across his back, and moved like a gray wolf towards the spectral hulk of the chancellery. Steiner watched them go, her part done for now. She would move to a prearranged observation point, a bombed-out clock tower with a view of the entire sector to bear witness. What followed was an hour of agonizing silence, broken only by the drip of water and the distant, muffled echoes of fighting elsewhere in the city. Steiner, shivering in the tower, watched through stolen German artillery binoculars. She saw the phantom counterattack ignite exactly as scripted. Headlights of panzers swung wildly, searchlights stabbed the rain, and the distinctive rattle of German and Soviet small arms fire erupted with fresh intensity along the intended axis. As predicted, SS units stationed on the periphery began to move, drawn towards the sound of the battle, thinning the immediate cordon. Then, at the precise second of Markovitz's calculated 0 hour, the ground beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden swelled. It was not a dramatic fireball. It was a deep, subterranean thump that traveled through the earth up into Steiner's bones. A section of the garden soil lifted several feet, then settled, as if a giant had taken a breath underneath. A geyser of dirt, concrete dust, and steam erupted from ventilation shafts, followed by a low, rolling roar that was felt more than heard. Lights in the few powered windows of the chancellery flickered and died. The hammer had fallen. Chaos, immediate and absolute, erupted at the bunker exits. Figures spilled out into the courtyard. SS guards, aides, medical staff, coughing, staggering, some bleeding. Searchlights from unaffected outposts swung wildly, crisscrossing the raining sky and illuminating the scene in stark, surreal slices. The hornet's nest was violently, perfectly stirred. Now everything depended on Teller. Steiner trained her glasses on the upper windows of the chancellery. She saw nothing. He was a shadow, within a shadow. The courtyard below was a pandemonium of running shapes. Then she saw it. A tighter knot of figures emerging from the main bunker entrance, more organized, forming a protective cordon around a central, stooped shape in a long military coat and a cap. It was him. It had to be. The timing, the reaction, the profile. It all fit. The scalpel had its target. She held her breath. The world narrowed to that circle of light in her binoculars, to the distance between a window ledge and a courtyard. She waited for the sharp, impossible-to-miss crack of the 30-06 round that would cut through the rain and the noise and change history. It did not come. Seconds stretched into a lifetime. The group in the courtyard hurried across the open space, heading for a secondary, safer entrance on the far side. They were moving out of the kill zone. Still, no shot. A cold, sickening realization began to drown Steiner. Something was wrong. Teller never hesitated. He was the most capable shooter on Earth. If the target was there, he was dead. The only explanation was that the target was not there, that the figure was a double, a ruse, or simply a high-ranking officer mistaken in the chaos. Markovitz's perfect breach, her flawless diversion, Teller's unwavering discipline, all of it had been executed with supernatural precision. And it had all been for nothing. They had been dancing in the dark, and the main actor had never left his concrete stage. In that moment, watching the figures disappear into the safety of another ruin, Steiner understood the true, devastating depth of their betrayal
and their failure. They had gambled everything on a single roll of the dice in a game where the dice were loaded. The OSS's cynical assessment was proven right in the most brutal way possible. Hitler was unreachable, a prisoner in his own myth, and their magnificent, desperate act of defiance was just another irrelevant tremor in the final collapse. The Ghost Team had made its move, and the universe had responded with a profound, echoing silence. The silence in the clock tower was not an absence of sound, but a presence. It was the deafening roar of a universe refusing to deliver the promised catharsis. Steiner's hands, clamped around the cold barrels of the binoculars, began to tremble. The vibration started deep in her core, a seismic tremor of utter, catastrophic failure, and traveled outwards until her teeth chattered. Below, the chaos they had engineered continued. SS shouting, the distant thump of the diversionary battle, the wail of a new siren. But it was all now meaningless theater. They had played their perfect parts in a play where the climax had been censored. Her mind, sharpened by years of analysis and survival, began its cruel, automatic post-mortem. The figure in the cap and coat, the protective phalanx. It had been too obvious, too staged.
In the heart of the most secure location on Earth, even in its ruin, would the F. Herrera be rushed across an open courtyard, exposed to the very threat they had just proven existed? Or would a double, a carefully selected officer, be used as a lightning rod, a test to draw fire and reveal enemy positions? The answer, tasting of gall and irony, was clear. They had not failed to shoot. They had been deceived into holding their fire because the shot was not worth taking. Their entire magnificent rogue operation had been anticipated, countered, and rendered futile by the very paranoia they were supposed to exploit. A new, more primal terror cut through her operational despair. Teller and Markovitz were still in the kill zone. Markovitz would be extracting from the tunnel if he hadn't been caught in the blast or its aftermath. Teller was a ghost in the chancellery, but a ghost who had just witnessed the failure of his only purpose. The discipline machine of their trio was now three separate, vulnerable components in a rapidly tightening vise. She had to move. The observation post was compromised by its own purpose. Descending the skeletal stairs of the clock tower, she entered a Berlin that felt fundamentally altered. The rain had turned to a freezing sleet that coated the black ruins in a glassy, malevolent shell. The sounds of war felt different now, not like the noise of a battle they could use, but like the closing jaws of a trap. Every shadow cast by the flickering fires seemed to hold the angular shape of an SS patrol. Every distant engine could be the Fremde Geister unit, finally closing in on the ghosts they'd been hunting. She moved not towards their primary rendezvous, a compromised location, but to the first fallback, a collapsed brewery cellar near the Spree. The journey of a few hundred meters was an odyssey of terror. She crossed paths with a squad of Waffen-SS, not the frontline variety, but the clean, cold-eyed security troops from the Reich Security main office. They were moving with purpose, not towards the fighting, but inward, towards the government district, conducting methodical house-to-house sweeps. The net was actively being drawn. She flattened herself into the corpse of a tram, her heart hammering against her ribs, as their bootsteps crunched past in the sleet. She reached the brewery cellar, a tomb of shattered vats, and the cloying, sour smell of ancient yeast. She was alone. The agreed window for rendezvous came and bled away. Every minute was an eternity of listening to the approaching doom of the city. Just as despair threatened to swallow her whole, a sound, a specific scrabbling pattern of 3 scrapes, a pause, 2 more, came from the entrance. It was Markovitz. He was a creature from a nightmare, covered from head to toe in a paste of black mud, sewage, and brick dust. One side of his face was a livid burn from the close quarters blast. His eyes were wild, the eyes of an animal that had chewed through its own leg to escape a trap. He had been in the tunnel when the charge detonated. The concussion had nearly killed him, collapsing a section of crawl space behind him. He had clawed his way out through a secondary maintenance hatch, half drowned in backed-up effluent, and had spent an hour evading the SS patrols now swarming the area like angry ants over a disturbed nest. He had seen no one. He had heard no shot. His magnificent explosion, his life's work of destruction, had been a firecracker under a mountain. The beast hadn't even flinched in the way that mattered. Together, in the putrid dark, they waited for Teller. He was the most capable, the most elusive. But as the night deepened towards a bleak, sleet-laced dawn, he did not come. The absence was more terrifying than any arrival. Teller did not miss rendezvous. Teller did not get caught, unless something fundamental had broken. Just as they were about to abandon hope, he appeared. He did not use the signal. He simply materialized from the gloom of the cellar entrance, a specter returning to its tomb. He was physically unharmed. But the man who walked in was not Jack Teller, the weapon of ice. Something in the internal gyroscope that kept him perfectly balanced and focused had shattered. He moved with a strange, deliberate slowness. He placed his rifle case on the ground with a reverence that bordered on the ceremonial. He did not speak of evasion or close calls. He spoke of what he had seen from the chancellery window. In a flat, dead voice, devoid of all emotion, he described the crosshairs settling on the figure's face. The magnification was such that he could see the man's stubble, the nervous tick in his cheek. He had exhaled, his finger taking up the first pressure of the trigger. And then, a fragment of a second before committing, he had seen the eyes. Not the possessed, blazing eyes from the newsreels, but the eyes of a terrified, confused, middle-aged man playing a role he did not fully understand. A clerk, dressed as a king. Teller, the man who trusted only geometry and ballistics, had in that ultimate moment trusted a deeper, horrifying instinct, the instinct that he was about to kill the wrong man. And so he had frozen. The perfect machine had jammed on the threshold of its purpose, betrayed by a human intuition he didn't know he still possessed. His failure was not operational. It was existential. He had not just missed the shot. He had discovered that the target he had carried in his mind for years, the focal point of all his frozen hatred, was a phantom. The real Hitler was a ghost he could not see, a presence felt only in the desperate performance of others. The rifle, his sacred instrument, was now just a piece of metal and wood. Its magic was gone. The 3 of them sat in the ruins of their mission and their identities. Markovitz, the force of nature, had spent his fury on concrete and dirt. Steiner, the moral compass, had steered them into a moral void. Teller, the flawless instrument, had found a fatal flaw in his own programming. They were no longer a team. They were 3 shattered remnants, surrounded by a dying city that was now actively hunting them, with no exfiltration, no support, and no reason to continue. It was in this absolute zero of their existence that the final, cruel twist of the knife arrived. From the depths of his pack, Markovitz produced a small, watertight canister. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, was the backup communications receiver, a tiny, crystal-set device they had never used, meant only for receiving catastrophic abort codes. More from morbid curiosity than hope, Steiner assembled it, connecting it to a makeshift aerial of wire strung across the cellar. They expected static, or the victorious proclamations of Soviet radio. What crackled through the tiny speaker, faint but unmistakable against a backdrop of jamming and interference, was a voice they recognized. It was Captain Roberts, broadcasting on an open emergency OSS frequency, a frequency designed to be heard by agents in extremis. His message was not for them. It was a general signal, repeating at intervals. To all Allied personnel in the Berlin sector, be advised, highest priority. The elimination of Axis leadership is no longer a repeat, no longer a tactical objective. All efforts are to be focused on survival, evasion, and the documentation of war crimes. I repeat, liquidation orders are rescinded. The priority is preservation of personnel and evidence for the coming peace. The message looped. The words hung in the fetid air. No longer a tactical objective. Rescinded. The coming peace. The timing was impeccable. It was the ultimate bureaucratic absolution, arriving 12 hours too late. It was the final proof of their total, complete irrelevance. The OSS had not just betrayed them by sending them on a cynical mission. They had now officially terminated that mission over the airwaves while they were trapped in its corpse. They had been disposable provocations, and now they were disposable entirely. The Ghost team had been decommissioned in a broadcast, their entire desperate, bloody crusade rendered officially null and void by the very command that had created them. In the gray, sleet-streaked light now seeping into the cellar, the three people looked at each other, not as comrades, but as strangers who had shared a terrible dream. The war outside was reaching its furious, violent climax. But for them, the war was over. They had lost it in the most profound way possible, by discovering that their war had never actually existed. All that remained was the simple, animal question of whether they would die in the rubble or live long enough to see the world they had failed to change. The cellar of the ruined brewery was not a refuge. It was a sarcophagus for their former selves. The broadcast from Roberts had not been a lifeline. It was the official pronouncement of their death as operatives, as instruments of any purpose higher than base survival. The three figures who occupied that space were now unrecognizable as the team that had trained under the Italian sun. They were ghosts who had discovered they were haunting their own corpses. The silence between them was total, a language of its own. Markovitz sat with his back against a curved vat, methodically cleaning his knife with a piece of rag, his movements slow, ritualistic, devoid of intent. The weapon was no longer a tool for a mission, but the last familiar object in an alien world. Teller had disassembled his rifle entirely, laying each part out on a square of cloth before him. He did not clean or polish them. He simply looked at them, as if trying to decipher the meaning of the components now that their singular function had been voided. Steiner stared at the wall, her mind a blank, white sheet. The analytical engine that had parsed dialects and motivations had short-circuited. All that remained was the somatic memory of cold, hunger, and the echoing silence where a shot should have been. They did not discuss the future. There was no future to discuss. The Soviet bombardment had reached a crescendo, a continuous rolling thunder that made the ground shiver and dust sift down from the ceiling in constant streams. The sound of small arms fire was now interspersed with the guttural, close-quarters shouts in Russian. The Red Army was in the district. Their end, when it came, was not from the Gestapo's Fremde Geisterhunters, nor from a heroic last stand. It was administrative, almost mundane. The brewery cellar was shaken by the roar of a T-34 tank grinding its treads over rubble just outside. The sound of booted feet, different from the German stride, heavier, more assured, crunched above them. A burst of submachine gun fire chipped at the cellar entrance. Then came the shouted commands in Russian, demanding surrender. They looked at each other for a final time. No nods, no signals. The choice was the same for all: a cyanide capsule or the unknown of Soviet captivity. Markovitz's hand went to his collar, his fingers finding the false stitch. He paused, his eyes meeting Teller's. In that look was the shared understanding that their vengeance, their purpose, had already been stolen. Dying here would be a footnote to a failure. Teller gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. He slowly placed his hands on his head. Steiner followed, a profound numbness washing over her. Markovitz let out a long, slow breath that seemed to deflate his entire massive frame, and raised his own hands. They were dragged, blinking, into the apocalyptic light of a Berlin morning. The world was monochrome: gray sky, gray smoke, black ruins, white sleet, Red Army soldiers, their faces young, hard, and etched with a terrible weariness, covered them with PPSH-41 submachine guns. They were searched with rough efficiency. Markovitz's knife, Teller's disassembled rifle, Steiner's forged papers, all were confiscated and tossed into a heap with other war trophies: Lugers, helmets, a portrait of Hitler with a bullet hole through the forehead. Their unique, dreadful story was immediately dissolved into the common slush of prisoners and spoils. They were marched through a landscape that defied description. It was the end of history. They passed a smashed Tiger tank with a dead crewman hanging from the hatch. They stepped over the bodies of teenage boys in Hitler Youth uniforms, their faces like sleeping children's. They saw a group of German civilians huddled around a burning barrel, their eyes devoid of everything. The Soviet soldiers pushing them along paid no attention to any of it. This was the wallpaper of victory. They were processed in the shell of a former school gymnasium, now a makeshift prisoner collection point. A harried Soviet political officer, a politruk, barely glanced at them. Steiner, summoning the last dregs of her linguistic skill, identified them as displaced Austrians, forced laborers. It was a thin story, but in the tidal wave of humanity it was enough. They were not shot. They were herded into a pen with 24 other dazed, broken souls. Days bled into a meaningless continuum. They were moved to a larger camp in the outskirts, a sea of mud and despair under a forever gray sky. They were fed a thin gruel from a communal pot. They were nothing. They were ghosts in a world that had no use for specters. It was here, 1 week after their capture, that the final closure arrived. Not with drama, but with bureaucratic inevitability. A different kind of officer arrived, accompanied by a man in a trench coat who was not military. They moved through the camp with lists. When they reached the pen holding Steiner, Teller, and Markovitz, the civilian's eyes lingered on them a moment too long. He spoke perfect, American accented English to the Soviet officer, who nodded. That afternoon, they were separated from the other prisoners and taken to a relatively intact office in a nearby commandeered villa. Sitting behind a desk, smoking a cigarette, was Captain John Roberts. He looked the same. Neat, pressed uniform, the calm, assessing eyes. The sight of him in that setting was more surreal, more violently dislocating than any battlefield horror. He did not smile. He did not offer congratulations or condolences. "You're a hard group to find," he said, his tone that of a man discussing a logistical snag. He explained briskly that with the establishment of the Allied Control Council and the need for cooperation, discreet inquiries had been made. Their identities as OSS operatives, he stated coolly, had been confirmed to the Soviet authorities through back channels, as a gesture of transparency. They were to be repatriated immediately. There would be no debrief, no report. Operation Phantom never existed. Any record of it was ashes. He stood up, signaling the meeting was over. As they were led out by a silent American MP, Roberts spoke one last time, his words aimed at the space between them. The mission parameters evolved. The strategic picture changed. You were professionals to the end. That's all that will be noted. The statement was so vacuous, so insultingly inadequate to the scale of their ruin, that it failed to even register as a betrayal. It was simply the final line of code in a program that had now terminated. The journey back to the West was a blur of lorries, airstrips, and deafening silence. They were given fresh clothes, subjected to a medical examination, and fed real food. They were treated with the polite, distant care afforded to convalescing strangers. Whatever bond had fused them in the cellar, in the ruins of Berlin, had been surgically severed by the experience of shared oblivion. They were contaminants to each other, living reminders of the grand, personal lie they had lived and died for. Their final parting was at a transit camp in France, under a clean, indifferent blue sky they had not seen in months. There was no handshake, no farewell. Markovitz simply turned and walked towards the processing line for displaced persons, his massive shoulders slumped, his destiny now to become one more stateless body in the shuffling queues of a broken continent. The hammer was now just scrap metal. Teller accepted a transfer order to a regular army unit being redeployed to the Pacific. He was a weapon without a target, being shipped to a new theater, where his specific skills were irrelevant. The Iceman would melt into the vast anonymous machinery of the ongoing war, his failure buried under a new uniform. Steiner was offered a desk, a minor clerical position with the nascent intelligence apparatus that would evolve into the CIA, processing the very kind of Miger and defector reports she had once been. It was a grotesque parody of her skills, a life sentence in a paper prison. She stood on the gravel path, watching the two men who had been the entirety of her world for a crucial, damning slice of history walk away without a backward glance. She was alone, truly alone for the first time since the jump into Brandenburg. A few days later, in a sterile London office, she saw a newspaper headline. It carried the wire report from Berlin. The Soviets had found the bodies. Hitler was dead by his own hand in the bunker. The world exhaled. Justice, of a sort, had been served by the monster's own cowardice. Steiner put the paper down. She felt nothing. No satisfaction, no bitterness. The man she had been sent to kill, the man they had broken themselves trying to reach, had ultimately been erased by his own hand. In the exact fortress they had been deemed expendable to provoke him into. They had not been the surgeons of history. They had been the barely noticed fever, the mild infection the body had walled off and ignored before succumbing to its own terminal illness. She walked out of the office into the bustling, victorious London street. People were smiling, laughing, planning futures. The war was over. She looked at her hands, clean now, and thought of the blood, the mud, the frozen trigger, the silent crosshairs. She thought of the old man in the ditch in Brandenburg. She had killed for a lie. They had all killed and bled and broken for a sophisticated, strategic lie. The Ghost Team had not just failed to kill Hitler. They had succeeded, in the most devastating way possible, in proving their master's thesis, that in the great cynical calculus of war and peace, individuals with rifles and convictions are not actors. They are atmosphere. They are weather. And when the storm passes, the architects of the climate remain in their quiet rooms, drafting the next forecast, while the rain becomes just a memory, and then nothing at all.